Good afternoon. I am Fay Twersky, the Director of Effective Philanthropy at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and also a proud CEP board member. Can you hear me in the back? All right. I'm also so pleased to introduce this next session, Philanthropy's Role in Moving Beyond Political Divisions. We're fortunate to have John Inazu with us with remarks and hopefully some provocation about what he calls in his recent book, Confident Pluralism. John is the Sally Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis. He has written extensively about the legal and civic practices that can help us restore civility, break out of our echo chambers, truly embrace diversity, and function more effectively and respectfully in our democratic society. After John's opening remarks, he'll join me in conversation with two leaders in philanthropy, Adam Meyerson from the Philanthropy Roundtable and Candice Jones of the Public Welfare Foundation, where we will talk more specifically about the ways that philanthropy can and should work across ideological lines, and also about where funders don't do that and why. I liked a lot about John's messages and stories in the book, Confident Pluralism, about how we need to feel more comfortable navigating diversity of views and how we will be better for it. I was particularly taken by the idea that confident pluralism requires what he calls a modest unity and spaces where we encounter one another in shared experience and shared enterprise. He talked about the pub, the public house, that used to perform that function as a place for public dialogue, debate, and association over a meal and a drink. And he shared the personal story of what it meant to be radically excluded from that modest unity when his grandparents, who were born in this country and of Japanese heritage, were interned during the Second World War. As I was reading John's book, I thought about my own work experiences and personal experiences. On the work front, we are trying to do more of this at the Hewlett Foundation, where this month, actually next week, we are launching our initiative to listen to people who disagree with us. It's an initiative for all of our program teams to listen to those who disagree with their strategies and our work. And some of our programs are right in the eye of the political storm these days. Our climate work and reproductive health are just two examples of that. And through the Fund for Shared Insight, which I am privileged to be a co-chair of and work with many of the funders in this room, we are exploring new vehicles for systematically listening to the people and communities we serve and to help incorporate their perspectives, their insights, their preferences into our grant-making decisions, thinking, and planning. On the personal front, I thought about my family of origin in the Orthodox and Hasidic Jewish community. My lifestyle was completely foreign to them, and yet today my extended religious family engages with me, my wife, and our children. We have developed and sustained mutual respect and affection. It is our modest unity. But in my personal life, the places where I honestly experience the most diversity of views and backgrounds isn't at work or in family. It is in the sports fandom and at the poker table. In the Bay Area, all types of people are Golden State Warriors fans. We cross race, class, age, and gender. This was true when I was growing up in Philadelphia, too. Sports is a point of connection and passion that rises above other differences. Same is true at the poker table. I love to play poker at the low-stakes table, and I don't have enough time to do it as much as I want, and my wife wouldn't let me do it as much as I wanted either. But a real cross-section of America is at the poker table. I have played with Trump supporters and Obama supporters, social workers and tech bros from Silicon Valley, African Americans, Iranian Americans, veterans, recent immigrants, people in wheelchairs, a retired convenience store owner who was born in India, and once a Chinese American grandmother who brought a stack of $2 bills around Chinese New Year and shared them around the table to bring good luck. We are different at that table, but we sit around the table, implicitly agreeing on rules of engagement, and we play together. That's my personal and recreational place of modest unity. Do we have an analog in philanthropy, and what would it look like? To help us address this question, please join me in welcoming John Inazu.
Thanks so much, Fay, for that introduction. I love the poker story. I hope that in these opening comments I can share both some challenges and opportunities, so to keep us real about what the challenges are, but also to encourage us with some of the opportunities. I missed Michael Sandel's talk last night, but I heard you heard a lot about the challenges, so I would like to maybe complement that. But I do want to start with maybe the reality of our differences and why they matter. And I'll start with a story. A couple of years ago, President Trump nominated to the Office of Management and Budget a man named Russell Vogt. And Vogt was a graduate of Wheaton College, an evangelical Christian college, and had written an op-ed along the way about Islam. And in the op-ed, he had said something to the effect of, Muslims, because they don't believe in Jesus, stand condemned. He was making a theological point. And somebody on Senator Sanders' staff had found that op-ed, and so during his Senate confirmation hearings for a vote, Sanders went aggressively after the nominee and said, I can't believe that you would have this view. I can't believe you would say that. I'm not going to vote for you. You're not what this country is about. And I was sitting watching this hearing. I guess that's what law professors do, is watch confirmation hearings. And I thought to myself, certainly Sanders would have been entirely within bounds to have pressed nominee vote hard on whether he would treat all citizens equally under the law, particularly given some examples to the contrary in the administration, that it would be really important to say, are you going to treat Muslims, non-Christians, everyone equally under the law? But to say that as a matter of belief that you have an exclusive truth claim, as do many Christians and Muslims and Jews and others, that puts you not to what America is about. I thought that, and I thought, actually, with respect, I think that's exactly what America is about. It's learning to live with our deepest and greatest differences over things that really matter. And so I penned a letter to Senator Sanders and sent him a copy of my book. Haven't heard back yet, but I'm still holding out hope. But I think when we're honest with ourselves, this is not just a Washington thing. This is how you and I react to the people and the labels we attach to those people when we hear words and phrases like evangelical Christian, or Muslim, or atheist, or Black Lives Matter, or Make America Great Again. And we have images that conjure up distance and disagreement and difference with others. And in some ways, these aren't going away, right? These are not solvable problems in any sense. We're not going to have some kumbaya unity moment. And it cuts against the narrative that many of us learned in school growing up, that we're one nation in pursuit of this more perfect union and that we're united. And in fact, there are some stark and important differences. Rousseau gave us one answer to what to do with those differences as a political matter. He said it's impossible for men to live at peace with those they think are damned. And so if you sit with that quote for a while, that's a very dire and sobering quote. And I hope he's wrong. My intuition and my strong belief is that he is wrong, that it is not only possible but necessary to live in peace with those who hold great disagreements with us. But to do so, we have to be honest about the disagreements. We have to recognize that they exist and not pretend to paper over them. And this is sort of the argument that I try to make in confident pluralism, to say we've got to be confident in our own beliefs and we've got to recognize the actual differences around us and then learn how to dialogue across those differences. So I have two main arguments that I set out, and a legal argument and a personal or civic argument. I'm not going to do much of the legal argument here. To learn that, you'll have to read my book. But there is one crucial aspect that I want to highlight, and that is that confident pluralism and learning to disagree and live with our greatest disagreements means strengthening the protections for the private groups of civil society. Charities, advocacy groups, unions, religious institutions, social clubs, even foundations, that strong protections for the private groups of civil society are necessary in order to live across difference. That's a paradox. In order to live with our deepest differences, we have to protect the groups and spaces where those differences manifest the most, where they persevere. This is not a unique insight to me. This is theorists of civil association and civil society, Tocqueville and Madison and Robert Putnam and others, but it's an important insight that we do have to protect, and these differences, these protections matter for all of us. The legal dimension of this is a little less known. I want to suggest to you that at least part of it lies in the First Amendment's right of assembly, and if you're scratching your head thinking, what's the right of assembly, you're in good company. Only about 17% of Americans can name it, but it is in there, trust me. It's one of 5 individual rights in the First Amendment. The others are speech, press, petition, and religion. And what's interesting about assembly is it's the only one of those 5 rights that requires more than one person to be exercised. I can do all of those other things by myself, but I cannot assemble alone. It requires at least one other person. And so one of the things that suggests to me is that right from the founding and also through a lot of American history and across a very wide ideological spectrum, people recognize that we don't just live in society as individuals, but that groups matter, protections for groups matter, constitutional protections like the right of assembly matter, and they allow us to preserve spaces to be different, to manifest dissent, especially when that dissent contrasts with political authorities, and that you carve out both private spaces but also the ability to engage publicly in the protest space, an extremely important right and one that is too quickly forgotten. So just a quick example here in the protest space, pick an issue that you care about. I don't care where it is on the political spectrum. I can find somewhere in this country where local authorities are unconstitutionally suppressing the ability to advocate and express the issue you care about at the local level. Our local governance of protest laws is a mess, and it needs a lot of reform, and it's scattered across local levels, and this affects everybody. So this is kind of a big tent right that is worth getting behind because it's whatever your beliefs are, whatever your causes are, it's affecting you and me and our ability to engage as citizens. And I think it's important for more of us to recognize why these legal protections are going to matter. But the law is not everything. Even though I make a living teaching the law is not everything. The law does run out. And it turns out that most of us can actually do quite a bit apart from the law. So take free speech, for example. You and I can say almost anything to almost anyone. There are a couple of exceptions, but they're really exceptions. And we can say hurtful and demeaning and psychologically damaging words to people, and we can destroy lives with the words that we say, and that's all constitutionally protected. And the law is likely going to stay that way. But that then puts quite a burden on us in terms of our responsibility to neighbor and fellow citizen. How are we going to use these freedoms we have with our speech, and how are we going to dialogue across difference? How are we going to choose not to destroy people's lives with our words? And I want to suggest to you on the civic or personal side of this 3 aspirations that can guide our approach to both our words, how we engage with others, how we form groups, how we protest, how we boycott, how we work out political disagreements. I'm going to talk about tolerance, humility, and patience, which I walk through in my book in more detail. And let me take a little bit of time just to define these. Tolerance in the higher ed landscape has become kind of a misunderstood word. So I often hear students or others say, tolerance means you have to fully accept me and embrace everything. You have to let you be you and me be me, but embrace me fully for who I am. And I want to suggest that's actually a philosophical impossibility. None of us do that. None of us are actually fully tolerant in that way. It sounds good, but it doesn't actually work. And so tolerance in the way that I want to suggest it to you is something far more modest, something maybe closer to endurance. Now we can build from endurance and maybe hopefully move past just endurance, but it starts with endurance, and it recognizes that for the most part, with some limits, we are going to accept people whose beliefs and ideas and practices differ than our own, even to the point of practices that we find problematic and harmful and morally offensive. That's a hard ask for all of us. As one philosopher said, the problem with tolerance is you only need it for the intolerable, which is true, but it does ratchet up the stakes, that it's a very hard aspiration to practice and to live into. It requires us to distinguish people from the ideas that they hold. Now, I want to suggest, at the limit, that's going to be a very hard thing to do, and we can probably call to mind examples of people when you think, you really think that? It's very hard for me to think of you and your ideas as separate. But for the most part, many of us are far too quick to put lots of people in those categories. And I think as a practical human sociological matter, we can separate people from the ideas that they hold and start with our common ground together as human beings, for starters. So that's tolerance. And then second is humility. Humility begins with the recognition that we're not always going to be able to prove to others why we think we're right and they're wrong. So we're past the era where, you're going to sit down with me and in half an hour of logical conversation, I'm going to convince you of the rightness of my beliefs. It doesn't work that way. If anything, if people are persuaded, it's going to be relationships over time that have to start with a kind of humility that says, you are maybe formed in such a different way and set of background experiences that this is no longer just a matter of formal logic. This is a matter of life experience and humanity, and it's going to take a lot more effort to bridge that gap. And then part of humility, I think, is recognizing our own limits and our weaknesses as we engage across difference. So in the foundation space, perhaps as you think about potential partners whose money and goals you find compromised, humility about asking yourself about the compromises embedded in your own sources of wealth and where they came from and past practices. And then finally, patience. Patience is the idea that you and I work to listen, to understand, and empathize, that we enter conversations charitably and with the willingness to talk to others. That doesn't mean we're going to agree at the end of the day. And so it might find out that you and I start talking, and I realize, oh, you were just as confused as I thought you were at the beginning of that conversation. But we can begin at least with a posture that says, I'm going to go in seriously. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to interpret what you're saying with the most charitable light possible. I think that when we practice these well, tolerance, humility, and patience, we can find common ground across difference, even when we don't agree about the common good. But bridging this kind of difference is going to begin by acknowledging the reality of our differences and not papering over those differences. Otherwise, tolerance will become that demand for acceptance. Humility will be replaced by an unwarranted certainty, and patience will turn to outrage. And we are experiencing this acutely in our country today. There are lots of factors, maybe Michael talked about some of them last night, but there are lots of factors that are not helpful to these efforts to dialogue across difference. The culture of shut up that says, I'm not going to listen to you. The big sort politically that has us living in places with more and greater political homogeneity, and the divide between religious and secular, the distrust of institutions. We could go on and on. We also have media and social media challenges. We've always had, people often ask me, are we in a uniquely difficult time right now, or is this part of where we've been? And I usually want to say a little bit of both. So we've always had partisan media. We've always had echo chambers in the news. We've never been free of that stuff. But the combination of that today with the intensity of social media pressures seems to be making all of us more on edge. And it seems to be that we are increasingly finding the people on our team and casting others as not only misinformed or disagreeing, but evil and ill-willed. I have two quick stories on where I've sensed this in my own life in the past month or so. I was speaking with a friend of mine, Ibu Patel, and we speak sometimes around the country on religious pluralism. He's a Muslim, I'm a Christian, and so we were talking about some of those differences, and we were at a college, and our dialogue was shut down by student protesters, and they took over the event for about 45 minutes and then turned to us with some pretty hostile questions, and that was it. And then the president of the school came up afterwards very apologetically, and she said, I think we're going to cancel the book table. I said, okay, no problem with that. But typically, I'm not usually the guy who gets protested. I mean, we're talking about pretty usually uncontroversial sorts of things. But that happened, and then the next week I was driving to Springfield, Missouri, and I was giving another talk in Springfield, and I turned on the radio, which I never do because I'm never in my car. I usually walk to work. And I turned it to conservative talk radio, which I don't know if I've ever listened to, but I listened to it on my drive to Springfield. And it was almost like the mirror image of the student protest experience. And so as I was comparing those two in my mind, I was thinking, at the base of both the student protests that shut me down and the conservative talk radio, there were actually, if you listened hard enough, there were some really legitimate issues from both sides and some important issues that matter. But the way those issues were framed and the tone at which they were delivered meant that nobody 1 inch to the other side of those entities politically would ever be persuaded. Right? It was completely an in-house conversation. And in making it an in-house conversation, there was a complete lack of charity for the other side. There was no sense that those people who are against us have any kind of humanity or goodwill or might be seeing things differently for good reason. And that's not, if that is at the fringes, we can make it work. But the more that sort of filters into the mainstream with the rest of us, the harder it's going to be able to dialogue across disagreement. So where then is the optimism here? Where's the hope? I had one reviewer of my book write that it was doomed to immediate irrelevance because he didn't think anyone would agree with it or think it was too fanciful. I don't think he's right. I do have a lot of optimism, and when I speak to especially younger people around the country, I'm very encouraged by what I hear. I'm also encouraged by the history that we have in this country, an imperfect and checkered and problematic history to be sure, but a history where as we look back and critique the bad, we also should name some of the good. So when we think back to the founding and say, how hard could it have been for a bunch of white Protestant men to get along? True, except that in other parts of the world they were killing each other over their religious differences at the time. So the fact that they didn't kill each other here is not a small thing, and it's worth sort of thinking through our history in ways that encourage us as well as make us better people as we deal honestly with the many shortcomings in our country. I also have confidence in the local stories, the people who are actually, when you get away from social media, are actually living lives with people across difference. So Fay's poker group matters. It matters in all kinds of really important ways. And even if she's wrong about the Warriors, perhaps more of us can find common ground in the beauty of Duke basketball. I'll move on quickly. Another reason for optimism is the importance of institutions. The institutions, including institutions like yours, matter and have mattered for some time. Institutions are where you form practices and habits that can inculcate people, that can turn aspirations into virtues over time with enough effort and enough will. You work in places and work with other people who have some of the greatest potential for practicing tolerance, humility, and patience, and for turning these aspirations into civic practices. But there are going to be some challenges, so a couple very practical suggestions. None of this is rocket science. I sometimes joke I spent years in graduate school learning the finer points of the First Amendment, and usually the stuff that most people pay attention to is the stuff I learned in kindergarten, but I'm going to share the kindergarten stuff anyway. So the first suggestion, work hard to get out of the echo chamber. The problem with echo chambers is that most of us don't realize we're still in them or that we've fallen back into them. So we're like the frog in boiling water, and we don't realize we're cooked until it's too late. So realize the work of getting out of the echo chamber is never finished, and refine, as I hope I continue to do, social media practices, diversify your feeds, comment less, and have conversations more. And then second, take the conversations offline. We're going to have far more traction when we meet face-to-face and have conversations. Have real people in your lives who challenge you and see the world differently on your boards, on your staffs, among your partners and grantees. And remember that who is in the room usually determines which questions get asked. And finally, start with the presumption that people are more complicated than you think, and that in most cases, you can find something with another person that you can relate to and learn from, regardless of the differences that you have with those folks. This is basically empathy. Empathize with people and start with the common ground. I'll illustrate this super quickly with 3 examples from my own life that you would not be able to pull from my biography. I'm a military veteran, and I was sitting at my desk at the Pentagon on the morning of 9/11. I'm a member of Gen X, and I am righteously outraged that most people have forgotten our generation. Thank you. And my dad died 3 months ago of cancer. And so, as I said those 3 things, right, some of you, not everyone, but some of you connected in a deeply personal and immediate way. You don't know me, but you connected in a way that drew us to our common humanity. And if we start there with those sorts of things, we can then get to the hard questions later. right? And within a context of trust and empathy. If this sounds somewhat ordinary, that's because that it is. In the end, this is a relatively modest vision. Fay mentioned modest unity. This is modest, but it is important. Confident pluralism and your work toward it does not give us the American dream, but it might help avoid the American nightmare. And that is a possibility for which we cannot lose hope. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We are joined now by Adam Meyerson. Adam is the CEO of the Philanthropy Roundtable, which he explained when I said Philanthropy Roundtable represents more of the conservative foundations. He said, well, we don't describe ourselves that way, but we don't deny it either. And before that, he was at the Heritage Foundation and also an editor with the Wall Street Journal. Candice Jones is with the Public Welfare Foundation, CEO since 2017. Before that was an advisor to an organization working in Chicago on stopping gun violence. She was a White House fellow, worked at the MacArthur Foundation, also did a stint as the director in the state of Illinois around juvenile justice. So these two are going to join us in conversation. Thank you both for being with us. I'm going to start with you, Adam, and if you can share with us your experience or that of the foundations who are part of your association and their efforts to work across ideological lines.
Well, thank you, Fay, and thank you, John, for your beautiful message. And I want to thank Phil and Grace for this really impressive conference. Our organization is in the conference business, and this is really first class, so thank you very much. As Fay mentioned, some people think of us as conservative. The key words we use are liberty, opportunity, and personal responsibility. And we don't think you have to be conservative to embrace any of those. Quite a number of our members have worked across the aisle, if you will, or across the ideological spectrum, mostly on specific issues. For instance, charter schools, the huge, the growth of charter school networks, multiple networks, where low-income children beat the odds. That was made possible by a combination of both progressive and conservative philanthropy. Veterans is a space where people work together across the spectrum. Criminal justice reform, I think that's a subject that Candice has been very involved with. There have been some really interesting coalitions starting at the state level and moving up to the federal level recently. And we also see in the workforce development, common interest in apprenticeship programs, internship programs, community colleges that really prepare people for work. These are all areas where you could say that conservatives and conservative and progressive funders are working together, perhaps on an instrumental basis. But something is beginning to occur that goes beyond just those instrumental, policy-specific areas, and that is, we certainly find among our own membership a real concern for the state of the country. Concern about all the vitriol that we see, the character assassination, the lies, and we see this across the spectrum. And a number of our members have been working together with funders from a different perspective to try to encourage disagreement without demonization, and to encourage serious debate. A good example is in the North Carolina Leadership Forum, which is now in its 3rd year. It's been sponsored jointly by the Pope Foundation on the right. Art Pope is considered to be the Charles Koch of North Carolina. The Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation on the left, and the Duke Endowment in between. And this is a group where for 5 or 6 times a year, leaders within the state, civic leaders, business leaders, political leaders, will come together and thrash out a particular policy subject. This year it's education. Last year it was energy. The year before it was upward mobility. And the goal is it's not necessarily to reach consensus, but it's to make sure people understand each other. What are the data that they are using? What are the assumptions that they have so that they can engage in democratic discourse better? I think there's a great opportunity now for an even larger left-right consensus, and that's over civic education. I think that we're hearing from both conservative, centrist, and progressive funders that there's a concern that Americans don't know much about the Constitution and the fundamental principles that we have anymore. And in this age of hyperpolarization and bitter hatreds, the Constitution is our protection. The separation of powers, the checks and balances, federalism, the Bill of Rights.
Right of assembly.
Right of assembly, exactly. All of the First Amendment freedoms and all the other freedoms in the Bill of Rights, Americans don't know much about them. It's not just at the student level, it's adults as well as students. And this is an opportunity for, I think, a very interesting left, center, right partnership in the years ahead to correct this and protect our country.
Thank you, Adam. Candice, you have also done really interesting work in different roles, working across the aisle, as it were, across ideological lines, with sometimes good effect. I wonder if you could share with us some examples.
First, the Public Welfare Foundation that does and has for some time criminal justice funding has funded both organizations that do a ton of policy advocacy and do what would be considered more progressive or left-leaning work, and then also have funded conservative groups as allies in that work. I personally in my career have done criminal justice throughout, and criminal justice is an issue that I always say the great thing about it for thinking about bipartisan work is that there was such an equal opportunity failure on both sides of the aisle that no one has the moral authority on the issue, right? And I think that can be so important in thinking about discourse, because sometimes I think what happens when you're tackling an issue, because everyone wants to take the position that they're in the right in many respects, they actually don't take any responsibility for moving the dialogue. In some ways, what we end up doing is opting out of the work. And on both, nobody could do that in criminal justice. So I worked for a very long time in the state legislature in Illinois, and it was actually horrible for a whole host of reasons, which I won't bore anybody. It was hilarious. Because I ran a state agency, I ran the youth prison system, and during that time, we both input a lot of different legislation, omnibus legislation that was something that we didn't actually allow, that the head of the House didn't usually allow omnibus bills because they like to make sure that nothing moved too big that they couldn't sort of really control all the details. And I did that first. I was hired under a Democratic governor and then stayed on under a Republican governor. And really, I think that the position that I took in working with what was a Democratic legislature and then ultimately a Republican governor in putting in place all that legislation and then closing a prison based on the changes that we got in place at the time, that we were making principled positions. We weren't making political decisions. And I actually think in working with folks throughout our legislature, that was really how people saw us. They didn't see me or my team or the work we were doing as partisan. And so we often became absolved of a lot of the fighting, and there was a ton at my time in the state because of that. But I think that is playing out in a lot of ways in criminal justice at a grand scale. One of the recent things that happened with the federal government, Congress has just passed what is the most significant piece of criminal justice legislation in decades with the First Step Act. Now, there was a lot of tension and debate about that act when it passed and was signed by the president. There were far left groups that took the position that they were never going to work with this administration, and so they weren't going to sign on to any, that whatever was being proposed had been distilled so much because it was a compromise of an earlier bill that had been put forward by a different administration. But there were other groups that took the position that that bill, which it has at this point, gotten more than 500 people out of federal prison to date because of its implementation. They took the position that people are suffering now. Their lives are being harmed right now, and so that there was no principled stance that they could take if they purported to be representing those lives that would allow them to walk away from the table when it could grant relief. And so it can be really difficult in these debates because I think we allow sometimes these very high-level arguments to absolve us of the responsibility both to do work, to listen, and to move the conversation. And of all the things, I think I have a patience for a lot of things, but I think ultimately my patience is I have no patience for getting nothing done. And that happens a lot of times because people just shut down.
Yeah. So Candice, the example you gave us from the public life. Now you're leading a foundation, a private foundation. Despite its name, I just learned the Public Welfare Foundation is not publicly funded. It is from the wealth of a family. And how do you think about working across ideological lines in the seat of philanthropy? Is it the same? Is it different? How do you think about that?
Well, I think it's the same. I mean, one, because in philanthropy, you're not. I like to think I'm working across principled lines, right? Like, it's difficult to say. I actually find myself having not a lot of patience for ideologues on the left or the right because there's usually not enough details in there to actually move work, right? So we've just said that we're going to focus our philanthropic giving, as you announced a new initiative, on justice reform. So funding both youth justice and adult criminal justice. And we will fund, we're hyper-focused on place and local jurisdictions on that work because criminal justice is really an issue where the rubber hits the road. And one of the things that we've made the choice to do in that strategy is say that we will fund in our jurisdictions a diverse set of tactics, right? We will fund advocacy, we will fund grassroots organizing, both of which tend to be more left-leaning. But frankly, we will also fund systems change, we will fund research, we will fund communications, and the spectrum of sort of ideological beliefs in that could be quite different. But funding whatever ecosystem is necessary to actually see the change we need on a local level. And I think that that's so important because, and one of the reasons we're so localized is because we don't want to be left up swimming in the clouds around big sort of partisan ideological issue and lose ourselves in whether or not we're actually advancing change on the ground. Because a lot of times you could just be paying to print up t-shirts that say we support all things that are liberal and actually no lives are impacted as a result of that. And I think that's dangerous.
Yeah.
Candice, I think you're so wise to focus and start this new initiative, focus on at the state and local level, because that gives you an opportunity for lots of experimentation and see what works. But in terms of building these kinds of coalitions, it's much easier to start them at the state and local level. Yeah. And Texas was a lot of the criminal justice reform coalition started in Texas maybe 12 or so years ago, and you had evangelicals who were concerned about they were concerned about who had been in prison ministry. They wanted to restorative justice instead of imprisonment, and you had small government conservatives who were concerned about the growth of spending in the corrections system. And they both had an interest in reducing the prison population, and began working with left funders like Pew and MacArthur and Ford and others, and built a very interesting coalition. It really helped on the right side that there were national validators, because in a way, as you were saying, to call for smaller prison population went against a lot of conservative thinking. So it really helped when people like Ed Meese or Newt Gingrich said, this is a good idea. I agree with these principles, and that gave cover to many of the conservatives on the side. I think a similar case could be made that President Obama in the charter school space, because of his strong support for charter schools, validated those progressive funders who were actively involved in that space.
I will respond to that, because I think this gives a great example of why it's so much in the details. I agree, the work, which started mostly in 2007 with the launch of What is Right on Crime, you're referencing this initiative by conservatives, Newt Gingrich and the like, to talk about criminal justice reform. And frankly, libertarians, which are pretty anti-big government, have been able to say that they critique criminal justice as a big public investment in something that they could stand back and say that has failed. I do think that it's important always to fan out, though, and talk about how we ended up where we are, which is, on Nixon and Reagan with some early efforts in the late 70s. And, we went from 200,000 to over 2 million in the system because of choices made initially on the war on drugs that was then proliferated in Clinton, right? So that's another example of that right-left failure that gets us to some of the excitement of what's happening now, where you have some agreement and we're moving in the right direction. But there again is the need to be principled, because I think the thing that we have to focus on in some of these coalitions is that there are places where there will be divergence, and I think we have to stay in conversation. I think a lot of people can agree on downsizing public investments in criminal justice up to the point that they then are proposing privatizing criminal justice, which I think raises other and different issues. And I think there's a similar issue, having been a part of the Obama administration, so I love to critique that administration in particular, about charter schools. I work for Arne Duncan, and I think sort of, again, a blanket statement about their overwhelming success probably deserves some caveats, right, on behalf of some of the people. So I think that for me, that's why it's so important in a discussion, and I think that's why the pluralism argument, because it presumes as human beings that we are intelligent enough actors to hold nuance, right? Like, you would hope so, right? That it doesn't actually have to be a soundbite, that we can actually hold a little bit of nuance, both in the groups that we listen to and support and are willing to engage with, but frankly in how we frame what is happening on any specific issue at any time, driven by whom. And so I just want to...
So let me ask a question of all of you, and including you, John, get you back into the conversation. Are there lines that you wouldn't cross, shouldn't cross? Are there, and what are they? And we talked about a little bit, some of that this morning about, should foundations be, policing ourselves in different ways? Are there actors that we don't want to be working with, and in the philanthropy world, and when and why? So I don't know if either of you wants to take that up, and then I'd love to hear from you, John, about this too.
Go ahead.
Oh, sure. I'll take that one. The thing I was thinking about when John was talking about speech, talking about pluralism, is that I do think that there is an incredible need for tolerance, for listening. The one tenet, patience is not my strength, so I fail on that one. What I think resonates with me a lot is humility, because I think what doesn't happen when we're shutting down on other things is that first thing we're doing is that we're not critiquing ourselves enough. This idea that we don't all need to still be listening and growing and having our ideas and thoughts challenged. That's why I love what your institution is trying to do by sort of putting yourself in that uncomfortable place of saying we actually have to listen to the dissent. The danger is that I think even in pluralism, even in the First Amendment, everything has to have a floor. The rule of law exists in part by there's a rule, right? There's a basis that there is a set of behaviors, a set of speech, things that can go too far, to up until the point you get to incitement, up until the point. And so I think as a philanthropic organization, we would take the position that we wouldn't engage if we felt like we were giving a platform to an individual or a set of individuals where giving them the platform could actually harm. It can harm the longer game. And I think that we have to be thoughtful about that. The nuance, I think, for us as philanthropy, whether you're on the right, on the left, in the middle, is that you can't presume that that platform is only on one ideological side, which is, I think, what oftentimes happens. That, for a progressive foundation, we presume that the only time that we would deny a platform would be if it's sort of right of center, when maybe there are times when somebody is saying something on the left of center, or frankly saying nothing, but saying it very loudly, which is oftentimes something that happens, I think, a lot right now, and we offer a platform, to that group or individual.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a floor.
Yeah. How about you, Adam?
Oh, I agree, actually, with most of that. Obviously, we've got a big problem now with violence against churches and synagogues and mosques and schools. And I think, anyone who is advocating that kind of violence would be, or defending that kind of violence would certainly be off limits. But I think casting a wide net, but proceeding very cautiously, and the building of trust is crucially important when you're dealing with political opponents, and starting off with small things. But learning to work together becomes absolutely crucial in that.
Just take the example of violence, gun violence, since you mentioned it. There are foundations whose money came from the selling of guns.
Right.
Do you think it would be okay, not okay, for a funder to partner with one of those foundations in trying to address gun violence, or does it not matter where the money came from?
I think it's what is their, I would look at what is their advocacy. If they're to defend Second Amendment rights is not to advocate violence.
Right.
So I think it would be important there to look at what they're advocating, and if they're advocating and defending violence, we don't see a lot of philanthropists that are doing that.
Yeah. John,
I'm sorry, Faye,
Yeah.
but the one thing about philanthropy is I think that comes up a lot about sort of, because we had this with a corporate foundation. I guess I'm trying to figure out where the good, clean money is.
Right.
Who's got that? Because we have such a short institutional memory, right? And we are a foundation that is working on a diverse asset managers initiative and thinking about that. But your point to our name, our money came from an affluent family with, God knows what kind of tie. Sort of I do think with that issue in particular, that pointed question, that was the point I wanted to make.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Let's
John.
just expand that. What institution of any power has clean hands?
Right.
Washington University that pays my salary is a lot of questionable investments and other sorts of things. So that helps inform my question. I'm a pretty big tent guy, and if you want to give me money with no strings attached, that's not a rhetorical statement. If you want to give me money with no strings attached, I will put it to good work.
But John, I want to come back to you specifically, because when we were talking and preparing for this, you shared a story about money that was offered to you and Ibu Patel to tour around the country that your university declined. So can you tell us that story? Now that I've outed you
now
about
that you've
that
said
story?
this very publicly. No, I think, we did, somebody from Koch contacted me and said, hey, we want to give you a bunch of money to work with
The Koch Foundation.
The Koch Foundation, with Ibu Patel on religious pluralism. And with zero strings attached. And that was important to me, as always, but especially because of some of the critiques I've read of them. And also, by the way, to let you in on a little secret, I actually don't know your world all that well, so I read things in the paper, but I don't spend my life kind of reading up on. But so I was thinking, free money to do something that I care about sounds good. And then there were people internally that were very concerned about the signaling and that sort of thing. So we ended up saying no to the money. And so I had, that much less money to do civic engagement around religious pluralism, which seemed like kind of an important issue. And so I was discouraged by sort of that. And actually what came up in my mind, exactly to your point, Candice, I started to think, well, I know some of the fellowships and programs that you, my colleagues, have been funded for by these other foundations, and I can trace the lines to those foundations and find some pretty nasty things pretty quickly. And so where are the clean hands in terms of, you're willing to take money from lots of places. So, and people will draw the lines differently. That's one of the challenges of pluralism. We're all gonna there's no such thing as a completely pluralistic society. Right. We're not gonna recognize the Minneapolis chapter of Al-Qaeda, right? So we're gonna draw lines, and we're gonna disagree where those lines are, but we've gotta, I think, be generous about the fact that we sometimes disagree about where those lines are. So to give you a counterexample, which I thought was quite positive, I was asked about a year ago or so to be on the advisory board for a new organization started by the mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia, after the protests in Charlottesville. And this is a guy named Mike Singer, and he said, we cannot let this happen. We've got to do something about it. We've got to talk about hate speech, even though it's going to be constitutionally protected. How do you regulate it as carefully as you can? We have to talk about protest rights. We have to talk about what led to Charlottesville. And so he quickly gathered this advisory board that was a really interesting group of people, which is part of what drew it to me. And then he got his funders, the Koch Foundation and the Soros Foundation. And then he got his staffers from Koch and staffers from the Anti-Defamation League, who worked side by side to pull off this conference. And then I persuaded them to hold the conference at my school. And so we had, 300 people fly in from around the country. It was the conference of mayors and the mayors of some pretty significant cities and police chiefs and the Department of Justice Counterterrorism Unit and a bunch of protest activist type people and a bunch of community leaders. And we had this 2-day conference over, how do we stop the Nazis and things that are kind of important. And that would not have happened without that shared money, those shared networks, and the shared cooperation. And it's not, we don't want to tell the kumbaya stories as if it's all perfect or we solved the problem. We didn't. But it's a start, and it's a start that shows a kind of goodwill. And then when you actually got people in the room together, you started doing the common ground storytelling thing, and you realized, oh, I actually now know you as other than that Twitter persona, right, or whatever it is, and that there's actually a conversation and a base to build upon.
We're going to do right down the line. What's your last bit of advice to this room on the role of philanthropy in moving across political division, ideological division? Anybody want to start? You get 10 seconds.
Let me just say that the Roundtable is honored to work with our sister organizations like the Council and the Independent Sector and others, and Center for Effective Philanthropy in defending philanthropy and charity as central to American life.
I would say get out of your networks and partner creatively.
I think philanthropy has a responsibility to execute on something, really. And I think it's a challenge that we all face and struggle with, and I think that it's going to be difficult to do that if you're sitting in an echo chamber.
And mine is be less certain and be more curious. Thank you.